His podcast is taking on a life of its own, and I absolutely love it. This isn't exactly what I thought the third episode would be, but this coming out episode actually turned into a two-parter. It was an emotional episode for me to make, and it took a few recordings to actually get the full thing out, which meant that I had to stitch a few things together. That being said, I'm super excited to present you with part one. I'm also super excited that we're getting so close to the first interviews, and I cannot wait for you guys to hear what these amazing guests have to say. So let's dive in, and remember, this episode represents my opinions as Charles Turtz. There is some heavy stuff in here, and it's not designed to diagnose or act as treatment for any health or mental health conditions. You should consult a physician or licensed healthcare or mental health care professional for anything that relates to your physical or mental health. For more information, please see our privacy policy at TURTZED.com/privacy. Have you ever been referred to as the other one? No? Not sure what I'm talking about? Let's dive in, and I think you'll have a much better understanding. My brother had the sport gene. It was as if he could pick up any sport and push himself harder. And he loved the game. He had soccer, baseball, track, and those were just the official school teams. He was gifted, and I am so proud of how much work he put into those sports. My father spent time coaching him and his teams, and as my brother put in the work, my father would beam. I felt like my brother was the favorite or the closest extension to what my father wanted to be, or maybe just what he thought his son should be. I did play some traditional sports like baseball and soccer, but I didn't love it. I wasn't very good at baseball. I'd be out in the outfield, bored out of my mind doing cartwheels, trying to keep myself busy. And even for soccer, which I actually did somewhat like, I never cared about winning. It wasn't my goal, and there I was also found on the field doing cartwheels when the game was happening on the opposite side of the field. I would have rather been doing gymnastics or theater, and even in middle school I wanted to do cheerleading because I was drawn to the stunts in gymnastics. I was proud of my brother and wasn't envious of his sports skills. I wasn't envious of the attention he got from my dad. I just wished that I could get that positive attention for the things that I loved. The better my brother became, the more I wanted to drop out of the things I was doing. The more I dropped out, the less I wanted to be at his games because it was just another reminder to me of where I felt inadequate. I didn't have the skills to communicate why I didn't want to go, and yet there my brother was, so supportive of me, showing up for things like my Shakespeare production, something I knew he wouldn't have been at if I wasn't part of the theater company. My brother actually supported me more than I remembered my dad showing up. I was looking for my dad at the ski resort we visited, and in order to try to find him, I went up to the bartender because my dad would often sit with him after skiing, watch sports together, have a drink, and talk. I won't be using the bartender's name, but I will tell you he was one of the nicest guys. I asked him if he knew where my father was, and although he did not necessarily know my younger brother and I as well, I knew that he was aware of who my dad was. He said he hadn't seen him, but if he did, he'd let my father know that I was looking for him. Then he asked me a question. "Are you the soccer player?" I said no because obviously he was referring to my brother. Then before I could say another word, he said, "Oh, you're the other one." I remember leaning over the bar and feeling like someone had just pulled the chair out from under me. I felt like nothing and no one. This man who had spoken with my father countless times had in his mind that my brother was the soccer player and me, I was the other one. Sadly, this wasn't a new feeling. It just felt like more external confirmation of what I already felt inside, that I didn't matter. When I think back to a time in my life where I felt most like my authentic self, before I experienced and understood the prejudice and judgment of the world, I think back to when I was 5. I felt free to be me. I remember feeling pure joy, and I can still hear the laughter of carefree Charlie. In thinking about it now, from a young age, it was pretty obvious that there was a possibility that I was gay, but I so badly didn't want to be different. I had enough trouble just trying to go from day to day, let alone growing up and trying to hide myself more and more every time I felt different. In 7th grade, I tried cheerleading only for 1 month. And for that, I was made fun of, and that carried through from 7th grade all the way to my senior year of high school. Even though, as I said, I only did it for 1 month. It became part of me and defined me. I was that guy that did cheerleading that one time. I was called gay or a faggot countless times in the hallways of high school, and even beat up, shoved against my locker, and hit in the stomach by one of the football players in front of his girlfriend, who I actually knew. And an entire hallway of people witnessed this during the 6-minute class transition time, and not one person said anything. So I kept it to myself, and I tried to pretend that it didn't happen. I quit something that brought me great joy, and I excelled at because I was ridiculed. Even My senior year, when I finally found some courage to join an all-star team in Connecticut with some of my girlfriends from high school, where I felt like I could be in a safe bubble to do something that I loved, I was still terrified to ask my parents if I could do it. I remember coming home and working up my confidence to even ask if I could, and I remembered my dad minimizing it to cost. Why would we pay for that when you're only going to do it for a few months before you go to college? Well, because I fucking wanted to, and it made me happy. Shouldn't that have been enough? I remember my mom supporting me and trying to talk my dad into letting me do it, and all I could think of was if this was my brother, and he was asking to sign up for a sport, the check would have already been written. And frankly, cost-wise, this paled in comparison to the support that they had already provided him for his sports career. I said I wasn't jealous, but if I'm being totally honest, I did feel an emotion. It was anger, and sadly it was misdirected at my brother. I later understood that I was just angry that two siblings were being treated differently, and I see now that this resulted in undermining the relationship my brother and I could have had for years. We were in effect put on different teams, and without knowing, we were pitted against each other without the understanding of what was happening and for what, only to be told by our father when we fought that all we would have one day is each other. It was a dichotomy that was so subtle that only recently did my brother and I realize that we felt like we were on opposing teams and had no idea why, when we were both trying to work towards the same goal. It can be hard to stay focused on the path ahead, which is very bright, and not look into the rearview mirror with absolute fury, thinking about how much time we missed out on because of this divide. It's in these moments I feel like I have to be patient and kind to myself because I can't go back and change the past. But what I can control is putting my best foot forward and further growing the bond my brother and I have because we can make up for lost time. So at this point, you're probably asking yourself, how small could you possibly make yourself? And I'm glad you asked. Anytime I felt like I was being my true self and pursuing what made me happy, I felt criticized. I became the simplest version of myself, small and boxed in to protect myself because I couldn't handle showing the world more than the 6 sides of the box I put myself in. And man, that box was small. Simple Charlie, the most basic form that could get through the day without really showing anyone anything, until I met the first guy that I dated. I remember feeling like I could be myself, and I told him things that I had never told anyone before. I felt connected and really seen for myself for the first time. And when it ended, as I described in episode 1, I could barely pull myself off the floor of the bathroom. And I struggled to get the help I needed because I struggled with the idea of telling my parents I was gay. Instead of telling them, I started therapy. I felt lost and alone because there was no one who knew I was gay, and I didn't want to tell people because I was in distress. I felt that the outside world would be more difficult if I was coming out because I was sad, and telling people while distressed would only be confirming the stereotype that it's harder to be gay. Once again, I had this picture in my mind of what it should be like to tell people I was gay. I wanted it to be when I was happy and in love. And as we all learned in episode 1, that's just not how life fucking works. Nothing is perfect. And while we try to make it easier for people to digest instead of asking for help when I needed it the most, I suffered even more pain. Many years after I came out, I remember watching Call Me By Your Name with a friend. Ironically, we watched it on Valentine's Day. We sat in the back row of the theater, and when the movie ended, neither of us moved. We stared at the screen with tears in our eyes. The movie had so much meaning and felt so relatable. For me, the scene that broke my heart was when he was at the train station and makes the phone call and he says, "Can you come and get me, Mom?" I had been there. It was that moment that I experienced laying on the bathroom floor, completely sad and heartbroken, wishing I knew back then what I came to understand years later, that I could have called my mom. And I wish I had asked for the support to help me start the path of trying to find my authentic self much sooner. If you know my mom, you know that the love she has for me is actually endless, and I'm so thankful for that 99% of the time. Love you, Mom. So why did I struggle for a few more years to tell my parents? I remembered spending an entire session with my therapist who was insistent that my parents would be totally fine, and he couldn't understand why I was so terrified to tell them. This therapist had been recommended to me through a family member, and the therapist continued to push back, making valid points that he knew my family and our views based on his connection, and I fully agreed with him. That was the problem. My discussions with the therapist were so focused on coming out, But what I was really talking about was being afraid of the wrath of my father if he disapproved of me being gay, and his ability to divide our family. Ironically, I actually said to the therapist, no one is going to care, but on the 0.001% chance that my father doesn't approve of this, I could lose everything. I was afraid that if my dad did not approve, my mom might take my dad's side, and my brother would be afraid to choose a side, resulting in me losing my entire support system. Although I can look back now and understand the psychology behind my fear, at that time, I thought I'd rather live my life as a lie than risk losing my mom and my brother because I was in such a dark place. I didn't know how to function without their support, even if it only meant partial support because they didn't know fully what was going on. I want to pause here because I want to go back to something very important and repeat it from the first episode. We all feel and experience things uniquely, and there's no code or standardized means of grading, assessing, or understanding what one person experiences as distressing or disturbing. I know for so many, the things that I feared with the loss of my loved ones, that this becomes their real life, and they really do lose everything and everyone in their life. I cannot imagine the strength it takes to live life authentically under those circumstances. I am so grateful for my family's acceptance when I told them I was gay, and it breaks my heart to know that it could go any other way. My fear didn't come to fruition, but for so many it does. And if that's you listening, I wish I could give you a hug because no one deserves to be treated that way. In fact, my fear was actually not a fear of their reaction. It was displaced fear. The problem with my entire conversation that day with my therapist is that we were so focused on being gay and telling my parents that at no time did we stop to ask, why are you so terrified of your father? I also struggled with coming out because I didn't want being gay to define me and be the only thing that people saw. I was already known as the other one. I felt like I had to fight for my place already because I was pushing myself to be a person I didn't want to be. The last thing I wanted to become was labeled solely as the gay friend, the gay cousin, the gay coworker. I felt like if I was gay, that would be all people would see me as. And I felt like there was more inside, but those parts of me were already dimmed to fit into the mold that kept me safe growing up. But over the last 15 years, like my view on Valentine's Day, coming out isn't like a graduation. It's not something that happens once. Coming out as gay wasn't even 0.01% of it. Most, if not all of us, have parts of ourselves that we try to conceal that often hold shame. If we're honest with ourselves, reflect, and work to push ourselves to become closer to our authentic selves, we can show up each day and transform a little more into our authentic selves. So when I finally decided to tell my parents, it was because I wanted to move to New Jersey. So not really sure where that fits on the spectrum of happy to distress, but there we were. At that time, I was thinking about moving to New Jersey and needed to tell my parents about New Jersey, but I couldn't tell them just that because it would make no sense without letting them know I wanted to do this because of a friend that I had made who was gay and I wanted to be closer with him. I remember my dad reacting with two statements. The first was, I would rather tell people you're gay than tell them you live in New Jersey. I still to this day am not sure what to make of this statement, but I had to share it because of its absurdity. The second was something I didn't even realize until recently was immensely damaging to me. I still expect you to have a normal life and not become one of those 50-year-old gay men still sleeping with 20-year-olds. Meaning, he expected me to get married and have kids. He was still trying to push me into the idea of what he thinks my life should look like. In the juxtaposition to his response, immediately after I told my mom and my dad, I began to cry. I remember my mom hugging me and telling me that she would love me no matter what, and this didn't change a thing. Even in coming out, something that should be mine, he insisted that I live my life in a way that it would be acceptable to him. That's the incredible thing about coming out authentically. You can take the opportunity to create your own life. And yet here I was, being pushed to still live my life in a way that my father would find acceptable. And so for years, getting married and having kids was the path that I told myself I wanted. I convinced myself that even though I was gay, I still wanted that white picket fence, the black and white cars, 2 kids, and a dog. I'm not really sure what I want at this point, but I know I have the autonomy to design my life the way that feels good to me, and it's a path I'm excited to explore. But for years, I was grasping at these ideas, and anything that I could hold on to keep my life as normal as possible. I think that there are a lot of people who follow society's expectations, such as girls wear pink or boys wear blue, or that they get married and have kids, when in reality, that's not who they are authentically. And I wonder whether my father fits into the latter. Today's story isn't over. The second part of my coming out story will be coming next week, and it comes with muted, big emotions. In addition to taking on big emotions, or the lack thereof, with the rest of my coming out story, we'll throw in my 27th birthday surprise and emergency appendectomy, and how it prompted me to tell the rest of the people in my life who didn't know. I will explain how I found myself at a pivotal life or death moment where I felt like the world literally grabbed me and said stop everything and reflect, because there are some decisions that there's no turning back from. So think about what you really want. I want to thank you for listening today. I know that this can be tough, and I know that this is going to resonate in many different ways for many different people. As I said from the beginning, I want to share my most authentic story, and this is part of it. For so much of my life, I've tried to put on a smile and a brave face to keep going, and today, I just had to be my authentic self with this story and tell it exactly how I was feeling. Even in struggling to remember the past emotionally, I know that all of the work that I've put in to better understand these situations has made it a much brighter future, and that's not just a glass half full. Putting in the work has changed the way that I look at the world and the way that I look at myself, and I wouldn't change it for 1 minute. The work makes me feel positive about the future, and sharing this space with the upcoming guests is meant to give you ideas of where you might look for support, more stories that might feel relatable, and ultimately with a goal of feeling like you're not alone.